He was 52, wealthy, and used to having the world move out of his way. So when his purple Lamborghini rolled into the marble lobby that Tuesday morning and a 58-year-old janitor lightly touched the fender to warn him about the wet floor, Bradley Keaton didn't see caution. He saw disrespect. By the end of that day, the janitor had lost his job. By the next morning, Bradley walked back into the same building expecting everything to be exactly where it belonged. But something had shifted, and he was about to learn how dangerous it is to confuse status with ownership. They didn't need an audience for it to unravel on a quiet Tuesday morning just after 8, when Bradley Keaton, 52 years old, American-tailored suit, still crisp from the closet, confidence polished by decades of being deferred to, eased his purple Lamborghini into the marble lobby to avoid a delivery truck blocking the curb, watching the hood catch the light as if the building itself were a backdrop meant to flatter him. Until Luis Alvarez, 58, Honduran American, nearly 2 decades working that same lobby, knee stiff from an old injury, blue gloves damp with cleaning solution, stepped forward and lightly touched the fender to steady himself while signaling that the floor was still wet. A small, practical gesture Bradley read as a violation. And Bradley got out immediately, circled the car, checked the paint with exaggerated care, and later that morning, annoyed and loud enough to be heard, told management he didn't want that janitor near his vehicle again, a request that became a termination by mid-afternoon. Luis calmly returning his badge, nodding once as he always did when pride had to swallow disappointment. And what Bradley never knew was that while he'd been pitching deals and leasing status symbols, Luis had spent years working double shifts, reading leases during quiet nights, pooling savings with 2 trusted partners, navigating a credit union that still believed in patience and paperwork,
and finalizing the purchase of the very building he cleaned. So when Bradley walked back in the next day, 48 hours after the incident, still irritated, still assuming his place was permanent, the building manager, Victoria Chen, 39, met him at the desk with a thin folder and an unfamiliar seriousness, explaining in a flat professional tone that ownership of the property had transferred overnight, leases unchanged, operations continuing. And when Bradley asked, half laughing, certain this was a formality, who had bought it, she turned slightly and called Luis Alvarez forward, not ceremonially, but administratively, as the new principal, and the lobby fell into a dense, ordinary silence. And Luis, still wearing his work jacket over a clean shirt, simply instructed security to enforce the no-vehicle rule until the floor dried. An order followed immediately, while Bradley stood there, 52 years old, and suddenly irrelevant, realizing that the man he fired for touching his car had spent years quietly touching something far more valuable, every unnoticed detail of the building he now owned. And if you're finding this story compelling, make sure to leave a comment below about a time when assumptions turned out to be completely wrong, because those moments teach us more than we realize. And subscribe to never miss stories that remind us dignity and patience often win in the end, even when nobody's watching. And Bradley Keaton had never been the kind of man who questioned his place in the world, because the world, for as long as he could remember, had arranged itself around him with an obliging efficiency that felt less like privilege and more like natural law. And he'd grown up in Westchester County, in a house with a circular driveway, where his father, a corporate attorney, had taught him early that respect wasn't earned through character, but commanded through presence. And his mother had reinforced this with her own quiet demonstrations of social currency, attending the right galas, knowing
which names mattered, which doors opened with the right introduction, and Bradley had absorbed these lessons not as ideology, but as atmosphere, the way a child learns temperature before learning the word for heat. And by the time he graduated from an East Coast business school, he'd already mastered the performance of authority, the firm handshake, the direct gaze, the ability to enter a room and subtly recalibrate its energy toward himself. And his career had unfolded with a momentum that felt inevitable because he'd chosen industries where confidence was mistaken for competence, where the appearance of success generated actual success, and where the network he'd inherited did most of the work while he took most of the credit. And he'd made money, Not extraordinary money, but enough to maintain the aesthetic of wealth. The leased Lamborghini, the downtown condo, the tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And he wore these things not with joy exactly, but with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd earned them, even though, if pressed, he couldn't articulate what exactly he'd done that warranted such rewards, beyond showing up and performing certainty in rooms where others performed doubt. And this was the life he was living when he drove into the marble lobby that Tuesday morning, irritated by the delivery truck blocking his usual spot, annoyed that the world had inconvenienced him in this small pedestrian way. And when Luis Alvarez stepped forward, blue gloves damp with cleaning solution, knee stiff from an old injury, and lightly touched the fender of the Lamborghini to steady himself while gesturing toward the wet floor, Bradley felt something ignite in his chest, not quite anger, but a cousin to it, a kind of territorial indignation that someone in a maintenance uniform had dared to make physical contact with something he considered an extension of himself. And he got out of the car immediately, circling it, inspecting the paint, as if searching for damage he knew
wasn't there, performing his displeasure with the exaggerated care of a man who needed witnesses to validate his grievance. And Luis, who had been working in that building for 17 years, had seen this performance before. Not from Bradley specifically, but from men like him, men who treated the building staff as part of the infrastructure, invisible until they made a mistake. And Luis said nothing as Bradley inspected the car, just stepped back with his hands raised in a gesture that was both apologetic and weary, a gesture that said, "I meant no harm, but also, I know you won't believe that." And Bradley didn't acknowledge the gesture, didn't meet Luis's eyes, just got back in the car and parked it properly outside once the truck moved. And Luis returned to his work, wiping down the brass railings in the lobby, thinking, as he often did, that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, because the world wouldn't hand it to you. And Bradley went upstairs to his office, still irritated, still replaying the moment in his mind. And by mid-morning, his irritation had fermented into something harder, and he called down to building management and spoke to the assistant property manager, a young woman named Sophie, who listened with the practiced patience of someone paid to absorb complaints. And Bradley told her, in a tone that expected agreement, that he didn't want that janitor near his vehicle again, that it was unacceptable for staff to touch residents' property, that he expected a certain standard of professionalism. And Sophie took notes and said she'd pass the message along. And Bradley hung up, feeling vindicated, feeling like he'd asserted a boundary that needed asserting. And what he didn't know was that Sophie had immediately felt uncomfortable with the request, because she knew Luis, knew he was one of the most reliable and respectful members of the staff. And she brought the complaint to Victoria Chen, the building manager, who had been managing the property for 6 years, and took her
responsibilities seriously. And Victoria called Luis into her office that afternoon and explained the situation with a careful neutrality that barely concealed her frustration, not at Luis, but at the position she'd been put in. And Luis listened without interrupting, and when Victoria finished, he simply nodded and said he understood, and asked if this meant his employment was being terminated. And Victoria hesitated, because the truth was that Bradley Keaton was a high-paying tenant, and the building's owners, whoever they were at that moment, had made it clear that tenant satisfaction was a priority, and Luis was technically an at-will employee. And so Victoria said yes, with an apology that felt inadequate. And Luis nodded again, and removed his badge and his keys, and placed them on her desk, and walked out of the building for what he assumed might be the last time. And if this story is making you think about the people whose work often goes unnoticed, hit that subscribe button, because we're diving deeper into how quiet perseverance can rewrite entire narratives. And leave a comment sharing who in your life deserves more recognition than they get, because those voices matter. And Bradley never thought about Luis again after that morning, or at least not consciously, because Luis had already faded back into the category of non-people, the staff who existed to facilitate his comfort and disappear when not needed. And Bradley went about his week, attending meetings, closing a minor deal that would net him a modest commission, having drinks with colleagues who laughed at his jokes because he picked up the tab, And he felt, if he felt anything, a vague satisfaction that he'd addressed an irritation and moved on, because that's what competent people did. They identified problems and solved them. And the problem in his mind had been a janitor who didn't understand boundaries, and now that problem was resolved. And he never asked himself whether his response had been proportional, whether firing a man for
steadying himself on a car fender was an act of cruelty disguised as standards, because Bradley Keaton had spent his entire life in environments where power was its own justification, where the ability to make things happen was confused with the right to make them happen. And so when he returned to the building 2 days later on Thursday morning, he was thinking about an email he needed to send, about a conference call scheduled for 10, about whether he had time to stop for coffee before heading upstairs. And he walked into the lobby, expecting it to look exactly as it always did. Marble floors, polished brass fixtures, the security desk on the right, the elevator bank straight ahead, the ambient hum of a building designed to signal wealth and permanence. And it did look exactly that way, except for the faint sense that something had shifted, some barely perceptible change in the atmosphere, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air pressure drops and you feel it in your chest before you see the clouds. And Victoria Chen was standing at the front desk, speaking with one of the security guards, and when she saw Bradley, she called his name, "Mr. Keaton," and he turned, expecting a routine greeting, maybe a package notification. But her expression was serious, not hostile, but formal in a way that felt unfamiliar, and she gestured for him to come over, and he did, wondering if there was a maintenance issue in his unit or a billing question. And she said, "Mr. Keaton, I need to inform you of a change in building ownership." And Bradley nodded, assuming this was a procedural formality that happened occasionally when properties were sold between investment firms. And he said, "Sure, what do I need to know?" And Victoria said, "The ownership transferred late yesterday evening. All existing leases remain in effect. Building operations will continue as usual." And Bradley said, "Okay, so what's the issue?" And Victoria paused, in a way that Bradley would later replay in his mind, a pause that contained something he
couldn't quite name, and she said, "The new principal owner is here and would like to address some building policies." And Bradley laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine confusion, because this seemed absurdly formal. And he said, "Do I need to meet them now? I have a call at 10. And Victoria turned slightly and called across the lobby, "Mr. Alvarez?" And Bradley followed her gaze and saw Luis Alvarez walking toward them, not in a maintenance uniform, but in dark slacks and a pressed button-down shirt under a work jacket. And Bradley's first thought was that Luis was there to clean something, or maybe to apologize, or maybe Victoria had resolved the issue by having Luis personally assure Bradley he'd be more careful. And Luis stopped a few feet away and looked at Bradley directly for the first time since the car incident, and Bradley saw something in his face that he couldn't process right away, a calm that wasn't submission, a steadiness that wasn't deference. And Victoria said, "Mr. Keaton, this is Luis Alvarez, the new principal owner of the building." And the lobby contracted into a single point of awareness, where sound seemed muffled and time seemed slow, and Bradley heard the words, but they didn't land correctly, like a sentence in a foreign language where you recognize the grammar but not the meaning. And he looked at Luis, and then at Victoria, and then back at Luis, and he said, "What?" And Luis didn't smile, didn't perform triumph, didn't offer any theatricality, just nodded, the same way he'd nodded when returning his badge 2 days earlier, and said, "Mr. Keaton?" And Bradley said, "Wait, you bought this building?" And Luis said, "My partners and I, yes." And Bradley felt something crack open inside him, not panic exactly, but a kind of vertigo, the sensation of standing on ground you thought was solid and realizing it's been sand all along. And he said, "How is that possible?" And Luis said, "We've been working on the acquisition for 3 years, and the deal closed yesterday." And Bradley looked at Victoria as if she might
correct this, as if she might reveal it was a joke or a misunderstanding, and she just looked back at him with professional neutrality. And Bradley said, "So you own the building now?" And Luis said, "Yes." And Bradley said, All of it? And Luis said, yes. And the silence that followed was dense and ordinary, the kind of silence that exists in lobbies every day when nothing remarkable is happening. And Luis said, I wanted to let you know directly that building policies will be enforced consistently going forward, and one of those policies is no vehicles in the lobby, even temporarily. And Bradley felt heat rising in his face, not anger exactly, but humiliation, a hot, tight humiliation that felt like being seen naked in public. And he said, understood, with a tightness in his voice that didn't sound like his own voice. And Luis nodded and said, thank you, Mr. Keaton, and turned and walked toward the elevator bank. And Victoria handed Bradley a folder and said, this contains information about the ownership transition and contact details for any concerns. And Bradley took the folder without looking at it and walked out of the building into the October morning air that felt colder than it had 30 minutes earlier. And hit that subscribe button now if you want more stories that prove the people we overlook are often the ones who've been planning the longest, because what happens next gets even better. And drop a comment telling us what you think Bradley should do now, because this is where choices reveal character. And Bradley Keaton spent the rest of that Thursday in a kind of fog, driving without destination, sitting in coffee shops without ordering anything, trying to reassemble the narrative of his life in a way that made sense, because the man he'd fired for touching his car now owned the building where he lived. And this fact violated something fundamental in Bradley's understanding of how the world worked, because the world, in his experience, was a hierarchy, and hierarchies didn't invert without warning.
Janitors didn't become landlords without some glitch in the system, some mistake that would eventually be corrected. And he spent hours that day Googling Luis Alvarez building purchase, commercial real estate acquisitions, trying to find evidence that this was temporary or fraudulent or misunderstood. And what he found instead were public records showing that an LLC named Alvarez Torres Ming Properties had purchased the building for $12.3 million in a transaction that involved seller financing and a credit union loan, and that the principal members of the LLC were Luis Alvarez, Diego Torres, and Rebecca Ming. And Bradley clicked through the filings with a growing sense of unreality, because this was real. This had been planned. This wasn't a lottery win or an inheritance, but the result of years of deliberate work. And he thought about the fact that Luis had been cleaning that building for 17 years. And during all that time, while Bradley had been leasing cars and buying watches and performing success, Luis had been saving, reading, learning, waiting. And Bradley felt something he rarely felt, a kind of existential smallness. Not because he'd been cruel, though he had been, but because his cruelty had been irrelevant. Because Luis hadn't needed Bradley's approval or acknowledgement or even his awareness. Luis had been building something entirely separate from Bradley's recognition. And that separateness was what made Bradley feel erased. And he went home that night to his condo, which now felt different somehow, less like a symbol of achievement and more like a rental agreement, subject to someone else's terms. And he poured himself a drink and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights, and tried to remember the last time he'd been genuinely surprised by another person. And he couldn't remember, because he'd spent so long surrounding himself with people who confirmed his assumptions that he'd forgotten other kinds of people existed. And the next morning, Friday, he woke
up feeling hollow, and went through his routine, showered, shaved, put on a suit, and went to work. And his colleagues noticed nothing, because Bradley had always been good at performing normalcy. But inside, he felt like a building whose foundation had shifted. And all day he kept thinking about the moment in the lobby when Luis had looked at him directly, without anger, without satisfaction, just a kind of calm acknowledgement. And Bradley realized he'd never seen Luis as a full person before, had never wondered about his life outside the building, had never considered that Luis might have ambitions, plans, strategies, that extended beyond the tasks Bradley observed. And this realization didn't make Bradley a better person, at least not immediately, because realizing you've been blind doesn't restore your sight. It just makes you aware of the darkness. But it did make him uncomfortable in a way he hadn't been before, because comfort had always been his default state. And now he felt like he was walking on a floor that might be wet, and he didn't know where to step. And the following week, Bradley started noticing things he'd never noticed before, like the fact that the lobby was always spotless, not because cleanliness happened automatically, but because someone made it happen, and the fact that the elevators were always functioning, not because machines maintain themselves, but because someone monitors them, and the fact that the building operated with a kind of invisible efficiency that he'd always taken for granted. And he started seeing the maintenance staff not as background figures, but as people who arrived before he woke up and left after he went to bed. And he felt a strange mix of guilt and resentment, because noticing these things made him complicit in his previous ignorance, and he didn't like being complicit. And he thought about apologizing to Luis, but every time he imagined the conversation, it felt performative, like he'd be apologizing to make himself feel better, not to offer anything real.
And so he didn't apologize, and weeks passed, and the building continued operating exactly as it had before. Except now when Bradley saw Luis in the lobby or the hallway, Luis would nod politely, the same way he'd always nodded, and Bradley would nod back. And the exchange contained no hostility, but also no warmth. Just the basic choreography of two people sharing space. And Bradley started hearing things from other tenants, casual comments about how management seemed more responsive lately, how maintenance requests were being handled faster, how there was a new community bulletin board in the lobby with information about tenant meetings. And Bradley realized that Luis wasn't running the building like someone trying to prove something, but like someone who'd always understood how it should be run. And one afternoon in late November, Bradley ran into Diego Torres, one of Luis's partners, in the parking garage, and Diego was carrying tools and wearing a contractor's vest, and Bradley recognized him as someone who used to do occasional repair work in the building. And Bradley said, "You're one of the owners now." And Diego said, "Yeah, me and Luis and Rebecca. We've been planning this a long time." And Bradley said, "How long?" And Diego said, "About 8 years. We started talking about it back in 2016. And Bradley said, 8 years. And Diego nodded and said, "Luis always said, if you're going to do something big, you have to be patient. You have to learn everything first." And Bradley said, "Learn what?" And Diego said, "Everything. How buildings work, how financing works, how people work." And Bradley felt that vertigo again, the sense that he'd been living on the surface of something deep. And he said, "So you were all working here and planning this?" And Diego said, "Yeah. Luis was maintenance, I was doing repairs, Rebecca was in accounting, and we'd meet on weekends, go over numbers, look at properties, figure out what we could afford." And Bradley said, "And nobody knew." And Diego smiled and said, "Nobody needed to know."
That was the conversation that stayed with Bradley more than any other, because it confirmed what he'd been afraid to admit, which was that Luis hadn't needed him to exist, hadn't needed his permission or his awareness or his validation. And this was both humbling and terrifying, because Bradley had built his entire identity on being needed, on being the person others defer to. And now he was confronting the reality that most people didn't need him at all. They just tolerated him. And the holidays came and went, and Bradley spent Christmas alone, because his family relationships had atrophied over years of prioritizing work over connection. And he spent New Year's Eve at a party with colleagues who talked about portfolios and market trends. And Bradley listened and contributed and performed engagement, but felt disconnected, as if he were watching himself from a distance. And when he got home that night, he looked around his condo, at the furniture he'd bought because it looked expensive, and the art he'd chosen because it seemed like the kind of art successful people owned. And he realized he didn't actually like any of it.
And he thought about Louise, who probably wasn't wealthy by conventional standards, but who had something Bradley didn't, which was a clear sense of purpose and the ability to work toward that purpose without needing external validation. And Bradley wondered when he'd lost that, or if he'd ever had it. And subscribe right now if this story is making you rethink what success actually looks like, because we're about to explore how Bradley's assumptions continue to crumble. And comment below with your thoughts on whether people can really change, or if we're all just performing different versions of the same script. And January arrived, cold and gray, and Bradley started doing something he'd never done before, which was paying attention. And he noticed that Louise arrived at the building every morning at 6:30, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And he noticed that
Louise knew every staff member by name, knew their families, asked about their kids, and he noticed that when tenants had complaints, Louise listened without defensiveness, took notes, followed up, and Bradley started to understand that what he'd mistaken for subservience all those years had actually been professionalism, and what he'd mistaken for invisibility had been dignity. And one morning in mid-January, Bradley was in the lobby waiting for a car service, and Louise was talking to an elderly tenant, Mrs. Kobayashi, who lived on the 4th floor. And Mrs. Kobayashi was upset because her heat wasn't working properly. And Louise listened carefully and then made a call right there in the lobby. And within 20 minutes, a repair person arrived, and Louise went up to the apartment with them to make sure the problem was fixed. And Bradley watched this interaction and realized he'd never once in his life made someone else's problem his own priority. And he felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door opening in a room he didn't know existed. And he thought, maybe this is what character looks like, not the performance of authority, but the practice of responsibility. And over the following weeks, Bradley started making small changes, nothing radical, but adjustments. And he started saying good morning to the security staff and learning their names, Marcus and James and Tanya. And he started holding doors for people and asking how they were doing and meaning it. And he stopped parking his car in the loading zone, even when it was convenient. And these changes didn't make him a saint, didn't erase the years of casual cruelty, but they made him slightly more aware, and awareness was at least a beginning. And one evening in February, Bradley was coming home late and saw Louise in the lobby going over paperwork with Victoria, and Bradley hesitated and then walked over and said, "Mr.
Alvarez, can I talk to you for a minute?" And Louise looked up and said, "Of course." And Bradley said, "I wanted to apologize for what happened last year with the car." And Louise looked at him for a long moment and said, "Thank you for saying that." And Bradley said, "I was out of line." And Louise said, "Yes, you were." And Bradley nodded because there was nothing else to say. And Louise said, "But people make mistakes, and what matters is what they do after." And Bradley said, "I'm trying to do better." And Louise said, "That's all anyone can do." And they stood there in the lobby, two men who had almost nothing in common except the fact that they lived in the same building and occupied the same brief moment in time. And Louise said, "Mr. Keaton, can I ask you something?" And Bradley said, "Sure." And Louise said, "Do you like your work?" And the question caught Bradley off guard because no one had ever asked him that. And he said, "Honestly, I don't know." And Louise said, "Then maybe it's time to figure that out." And Bradley nodded and walked to the elevator and went up to his condo and sat in the dark for a long time thinking about what he actually wanted from his life. And the answer didn't come that night or the next week or even the next month. But the question stayed with him like a seed planted in soil, waiting for conditions to change. And spring came and the city began to thaw, and Bradley started volunteering at a community center in his old neighborhood, teaching basic financial literacy to high school students. And he wasn't particularly good at it at first because teaching requires humility and patience, and Bradley had spent his life performing certainty. But the students asked good questions and challenged his assumptions, and slowly he began to find something in the work that felt real. And one afternoon in April, Bradley ran into Rebecca Ming, Louise's other partner, in the building's coffee shop. And Rebecca was a sharp woman in her early 40s who'd been the building's accountant before becoming co-owner, and she was reviewing
Spreadsheets on her laptop. And Bradley asked if he could join her, and she said sure. And they talked about the building, about the challenges of property management,
about the balance between profitability and tenant satisfaction. And Rebecca said, "You know, Luis almost didn't want to buy this building." And Bradley said, "Why?" And Rebecca said, "Because of people like you." And Bradley felt his face flush and said, "I understand." And Rebecca said, "But he did it anyway, because he believed the building could be something better." And Bradley said, "Do you think it is?" And Rebecca looked at him directly and said, "Yes, but not because we're better owners, because we care about the people who live and work here." And Bradley said, "I think I'm starting to understand that." And Rebecca said, "Good, because understanding is the first step toward not being an asshole." And Bradley laughed despite himself and said, "Fair enough." And they talked for another hour about real estate, about Houston, about the ways neighborhoods change and who benefits from that change. And Bradley left the conversation feeling like he'd been given a small piece of something valuable, not absolution, but perspective. And if you're still with this story, hit that subscribe button because we're in the final stretch and it's about to come full circle. And comment below telling us whether you think Bradley's arc feels earned or if redemption is something that takes more than a few months, because that question matters. And summer arrived, hot and humid, and the building's air conditioning struggled to keep up. And Luis hired additional contractors to upgrade the system. And Bradley saw him in the lobby one afternoon, covered in dust from inspecting the ductwork. And Bradley said, "You didn't have to do that yourself." And Luis said, "I know, but I want to understand how everything works." And Bradley said, "That makes sense." And Luis said, "Mr. Keaton, can I give you some advice?" And Bradley said, "Please." And Luis said, "Stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be useful." And Bradley said, "That's harder than it sounds." And Luis said, "I know, but it's the only thing that matters." And they shook hands. And Bradley went upstairs and looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who'd spent 52 years building a self that wasn't worth defending. And he thought about Luis, who'd spent nearly 6 decades building something quiet and real. And he realized that the story he'd been telling himself about his own life was a fiction, and that the truth was simpler and harder, which was that he'd been given every advantage and done almost nothing with it, while Luis had been given almost nothing and built something lasting. And that realization didn't destroy Bradley, but it did humble him in a way that felt necessary. And he thought about the Lamborghini, which he'd sold in March and replaced with a used Honda, and about the condo, which he was considering selling to move somewhere smaller, and about the life he'd constructed out of symbols and performances. And he wondered what it would feel like to build a life out of substance instead. And he didn't have an answer, but he was beginning to think the question itself was worth asking. And one evening in late August, Bradley was walking through the lobby and saw Luis sitting on one of the benches, looking tired. And Bradley sat down next to him and said, "Long day." And Luis said, "Yeah, but good." And Bradley said, "Can I ask you something?" And Luis said, "Sure." And Bradley said, "Do you ever regret it? Buying this place? Taking on all this responsibility?" And Luis thought for a moment and said, "No, because this is what I wanted." And Bradley said, "Why?" And Luis said, "Because I wanted to prove that people like me belong in rooms we're usually not allowed into." And Bradley nodded, and they sat there in silence, watching people come and go, residents and delivery workers and guests. And Luis said, "Mr.
Keaton, you know what the hardest part is?" And Bradley said, "What?" And Luis said, "Not letting anger make you cruel." And Bradley said, "Is that what I did?" And Luis said, "Yes, but you're learning." And Bradley said, "I'm trying." And Luis said, "That's enough." And they sat there as the sun set and the lobby lights came on, and the building continued its quiet work of sheltering people. And the city hummed outside, indifferent and enormous, and full of stories just like this one.
And Bradley thought about the Tuesday morning when this all started, when he'd driven his car into the lobby and set off a chain of events he never could have predicted. And he thought about how small that moment seemed now and how large its consequences had been. And he realized that every moment was like that, full of potential trajectories, invisible choices that would only reveal their significance later. And he stood up and said, "Good night, Mr. Alvarez." And Luis said, "Good night, Mr. Keaton." And Bradley walked to the elevator and went up to his condo and sat by the window and looked out at the city and thought about all the people in all the buildings, working jobs that no one noticed, building lives that no one celebrated, carrying dignity that no one acknowledged. And he thought about how easy it is to miss those people, to look past them, to treat them as scenery. And he thought about how much richer the world becomes when you stop missing them, when you start seeing them as the protagonists of their own stories, rather than the extras in yours. And he thought about Luis, who'd spent 17 years cleaning floors and reading leases and planning a future that no one believed he could achieve, and who'd done it anyway, not for applause, but because the work itself mattered. And Bradley realized that this was what integrity looked like, not the performance of virtue, but the patient accumulation of action. And he thought about his own life and wondered if it was too late to build something real. And he decided it probably wasn't. But it
would require letting go of everything he'd used to define himself, and that letting go would be painful, because identity, even false identity, is comfortable, and the truth is uncomfortable, but necessary. And he sat there for a long time, as the city lights blinked on and off. And somewhere in the building, Louise was probably still working, going over budgets, or talking to tenants, or fixing something that needed fixing. And Bradley felt a kind of gratitude, not because Louise had forgiven him, but because Louise had shown him what a life of substance could look like. And that example was worth more than any lesson he'd learned in business school, or any deal he'd ever closed. And the night deepened, and the building settled. And Bradley thought about the fact that this was just one building in one city, and that all over the country, all over the world, there were people like Louise, people working quietly, building patiently, carrying dignity in their hands like something fragile and valuable. And he thought about how rarely those people were seen, and how much the world depended on them. And he thought about the fact that he'd been one of the people who didn't see them, and that this blindness had cost him something important, though he couldn't quite name what. And he thought about the fact that change is possible, but difficult, and that awareness is necessary, but not sufficient, and that trying is better than not trying, even when you fail. And he thought about the car, and the lobby, and the moment when everything shifted, and he realized that the story wasn't really about him at all. It was about Louise, and about all the people who do the work that makes the world function, and who do it without recognition, without applause, without the assumption that they deserve to be seen. And he thought about how much he'd missed by not seeing them, and how much he still had to learn. And he made a decision then, sitting by the window, in his expensive condo, in a building he no longer owned, even in his imagination, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to see better. And that seemed like a small goal, almost embarrassingly small, but it also seemed like the only goal that mattered. And so he stood up and turned off the lights and went to bed. And the building kept standing, and the sea kept humming, and somewhere Luis Alvarez was probably asleep, dreaming, or not dreaming, just resting after another day of work that mattered. And if you made it to the end of this story, thank you for sticking with it. And if it changed how you think about the people you don't usually notice, then it did its job. So subscribe to keep these stories coming, because every person has a story worth hearing. And comment below with the name of someone in your life who deserves more recognition, because those names matter. And this is how we start seeing better, by naming the people we've overlooked and honoring the work that holds the world together, one quiet gesture at a time.